وكلابا أما ونوستا انشكواتشيشا للقولي وتقول شواش شنوكنوك نليلتما تطلق أمهاش بتينش مش لاقن الجاونة تتميخش إيكوكتلما ني ثلاثي تيوخا ميخواش واش ان شقات إخيناش لا لاكو ششوا ان شنوكنوك Lorna Williams is my English name. And what I said was that it really makes me happy. I introduced myself to the land here, the land of the Coquitlam, and it gives me real pleasure to be here and to be speaking on this land because my father had people here. His sisters came and they lived here, and he ran a pack train from our valley here during the gold rush. And when the farmers, the ranchers, and the people looking for gold came through our valley. And so we have relatives here. I don't know who they are, but so I wanted to be able to lay my language down on this ground because we're connected to the people here. So I'm going to be talking today about the process of what institutions need to do in order to bring and to live the indigenous world in their institutions. All of the institutions that we as the indigenous people of this land have to work with get to their education, their knowledge, their training, their wisdom from these higher education institutions. And in order for the people who learn to be able to, in order for them to know how to work with our people in a respectful and honoring way, they need to do things differently. They need to make space and make room for the indigenous world. And so I thought I would talk about indigenous knowledge and wisdom and the process of decolonization, because that's what we all need to be able to do, and the process of reconciling two or more worldviews. And I'll use examples from the work that I've been doing in higher education to be able to, I think, give some good examples of the struggles, the challenges, the opportunities when we do this kind of work. So let me begin by saying that my relationship with Simon Fraser goes back a long way. And I think it's part of the foundation of the work that I've been doing all my life, had its roots, in a sense, here. So it had its roots on this territory because of my father and his sisters, who both lived at the foot of these mountains. But when in the mid-60s, late 60s, when the government was going to move to send the First Nations people, Aboriginal people, to public school, they began by preparing the way. And we were to be sent from Mount Currie, we were to be sent to Pemberton. And they began to build the school there. And but at that time, they assessed us, but the assessment tools that they used at that time were not capable of really assessing people who came from a very different experience and a very different way of being in the world. And so I think that we were misread. And so our experience in public school, I think, was very unfortunate. And because we were seen to be defective, we were seen to be deficient, we were seen to be primitive and not very intelligent. And these assessments confirmed that for them. And then in 1967, the Pierre Trudeau government thought that the way in which they were going to make us better, make us civilized, was to have us move away from our communities. And public school was going to do that. And so they brought into discussion in the House of Commons a white paper that was going to be the dismantling of our communities and our final assimilation into Canada. My community was part of people from across the country who said that cannot happen, because what we know how to be who we are is from our land. And we could not remove ourselves. You know, the little tiny pieces of our land that we still had left, we could not give that up. The responsibility for that land, the responsibility for maintaining that relationship, the source of our knowledge, the source of our language is on that land. And we couldn't turn our backs to that. And that's something I think that settlers and immigrants cannot comprehend. That because they were able to give up their land, and they think that they're okay because they did. They think that it's easy for us to be able to do that. But our stories, exist from the beginning of this land. And so how can we turn our backs on our relatives? And so we worked to counter that white paper in the discussions. And it was interesting because it's been education that has been, in a sense, the battleground. From the time that we've been colonized, education has been the battleground for our minds, our spirit, our hearts, and our voice. And so the people in my community decided that we were going to do something, and education was again going to be the tool. And but we didn't know at that time what it was that we needed to do in order to be able to continue to know who we are, to get an education so that we didn't have to give up our identity. So how can we be engaged in learning in these times without giving up who we are? Because that's what we've been asked to do through education, is to give up our knowledge, to give up our language, to give up our way of being in the world, our very existence. We have to give that up in order to be able to learn in the educational institutions that have been created in this country. And so our challenge was, how do we create an education system now in where our children their children after them, will continue to be Litwet Ul, will continue to be of this land, will know their history, will know their language, and all the conceptual tools that they have, that they can gain, and that they can continue through our language, our stories, our songs, our dances, our relationship with the animals, the plants, and the land. And but at the same time, how can we create a school, a way of learning, where our children also can learn from the time in which they live, learn from, because we live in the midst of many other peoples. So how do we learn so that we can cross between worlds without losing a sense of self? And that was our challenge. And so we began by talking to people in the community. I was a young woman then, and just starting out on my own life, my career. And I was asked to conduct a survey. So I interviewed families, and my question to them was, we have an opportunity to start a school. So what do you want your children to learn? And that was really an important question. And they told us we want our children to be able to speak our language, to continue to speak our language. We want our children to know their history, their Lil'wat history. We want our children to be able to learn from this other world, so that if they want to go to school, continue on with school, if they want to be able to go into employment, that they're able to do that. And so that's what we began to do. And one of the ways in which we did that was we said, we want our people to be teachers in this school. So how do we prepare teachers for this kind of school that honors the place where people come from, where they can celebrate their identity and their way of life, their knowledge? And because if we send our people to the universities to learn to be teachers, then what will happen is they'll come back and they'll colonize us. They'll be the new colonizers of our people. And we cannot let that happen. And so we began to look around and for who might be able to help us to build a teacher education program where that wouldn't happen. We also said that we need to understand colonization because we need to know when we start to colonize our own people. We need to know what that process is. And so we visited universities to see who would work with us. And at that time, Simon Fraser had a new president who'd made a commitment to, at that time, they called it Native education. She said that in her inaugural speech. And so we came here and we said, this is what you said. And so what can we do to make that happen? And they had hired some new people to try to carry out that work. And so we created a teacher education program. We designed it so that it included us learning how to teach our language in school, because we wanted to be able to teach in both languages. We wanted our children to have the strength of being able to communicate in our own language, but also to be able to use English, and to be able to cross both languages equally. And this wasn't a new concept for our people, because I remember as a child, when people would come into our village, people spoke more than one language. They communicated in more than one language. They were able to make sense of and to talk to one another, even when we spoke in different dialects. That wasn't a problem. Even when people didn't know a language, they figured out how to communicate. So we knew that it was possible for humans to be able to do that. In the Lil'wat world, when a person comes of age, usually at puberty, and they begin to learn outside of their family, they're the ones who choose who their teacher will be, because they want, and we think we choose who our teacher will be, but it's also we know that we're steered in that direction, because of our interests, because of what we know, because the old people have really looked at what our gifts are, and so they help us to develop those gifts, but they also help us to see where we might need to learn more, and they help us to go in that direction too, because their way is to make us a balanced human being, who knows how to work for themselves, but really for the family and for the community and for our descendants. And so we never think about learning and doing just for ourselves. It's always for the bigger world beyond ourselves. And so even though we say we choose our teacher, it's really a much more collaborative and a negotiated thing. And so we thought, how could we bring that idea into into our teacher education program? And one of the things that I've always credited, the people in my community who had the brilliance and the foresight to be able to do this, but also that a university was willing to engage with us, to explore that and to make it happen. And so for the first few years, that's what we did. The students in the teacher education program met every prof that came from this mountain to our community. They came out there and met with us, and then we chose who would teach us. So we not only negotiated who, but what we would learn, because it was really important for us that we were not taught in ways that we would continue colonization. And so we had to be very careful that the people who came to teach us would not impose those ideas on us, even though at that time it was just the beginning of those kinds of conversations, and we really weren't sure either. And we were just learning ourselves what that meant, what imperialism meant, what colonization meant, but we were prepared to be engaged, and the university was prepared to engage with us. And even though there were some people who came, who it was their very first time ever meeting people like us, Aboriginal people, First Nations people. But because of their own sense of curiosity, their the expertise that they developed in their knowledge systems and their ways, and their willingness to question, their willingness to really converse with us, that I think that that was the basis upon which we chose people. And I remember we were in the midst of trying to save our valley and blockading a road because the government was going to impose a highway through our community. And that had not been an agreement. The agreement was that they were going to go through our valley to deal with flooding. And then all of a sudden, because they were allowed to go through our valley, they now were going to own the road. And we were afraid that it was going to affect our people. And so in 1975, my people in my community blockaded the road. And one of our courses, I remember we were taking English during that time, and that became a topic of discussion and of writing. And I remember we wrote poems, we wrote short stories, we wrote essays, all different kinds of writing. And I really feel that many of us found our academic voice, and it was because the man who taught this course was able to let us learn to write, and to use our writing voice, our literate voice, to talk about the things that were important to us, and it was really, I think, healing. It was provocative, because everybody in the class didn't believe in the same way. And it gave us an opportunity, to explore that, to question it, and to really think about where our ideas were coming from and how it affected the people in our community and the future generations, how it was going to impact the children whose lives were being touched by this school. And one of the other areas that really was an important part of discussion, because we wanted to teach bilingually, we were learning our language, but our language had always been an oral language, a language developed through speaking, conversing, and it wasn't written down in other traditions. And but we were developing an alphabet. We were developing our writing system and working with a young linguist who we hired. And we were learning our language, not just orally, but also through literacy. And I remember we had many, many conversations and discussions about what that does to a language. When you shift from an oral tradition to a literate tradition, what does that do to knowledge? What does that do to relationships? How does it disconnect or connect? And how does it change a language? These are questions that are important to us to explore, to understand, to come to terms with, to reconcile. And this, throughout my career, I've watched and listened, and as people have had the same conversation. And that has been really valuable to me in the roles that I've played in my career. to have had those very conversations in my community as we tried to respond to that. I also, what was really valuable to me was to see that actually writing, using literacy, was something that the young people who grew up in that tradition, they could make use of literacy. And I could see how challenging it was to people who grew up in the oral tradition, how literacy totally confused them. It wasn't helpful. And that they always resorted to listening and making sense of what was being said and using their memory. So memory is something that when you live in an oral world, being able to observe, listening, and using your memory works really differently. And that was something that we had to explore. So how do you learn? How do you engage? What processes do you use when you live in an oral world and when you live in a literate world? And that's something else that we had to explore. The other thing that we had to explore was the whole area of silencing. When a people are invisible, and being invisible is habituated and accepted and normal. And so for children to have never learned in a school about their relationships with the land, with their relationships with the unseen world, to have never had that in the places that we now call school, and to bring that back, to include that in the conversation, in the study, was something else that we had to learn what it means to become visible, what it means to become, for our knowledge system to become visible to us within the walls called school. In the school, we decided that the little piece of land that we now can still call our homeland, very tiny, what are we going to do on this land? Because that's a different relationship. And how do we maintain that relationship with that land? And how do you do that, maintain that relationship from within four walls? And so we began an On the Land program so that young people could go and spend time on our land. Because there's so much of what we know. The knowledge is born on different parts of the land. The language is born on different parts of the land. All the conceptual work is from the stories about that land. And the songs that we have, the dances we have, are from people's stories. And those were a really important part of who we are. So our knowledge is not just within books. It's not only there. And this notion that the knowledge worth knowing is only in books is something that we had to figure out how to counter. That yes, we can learn from books, and we're blessed that we can. But there are many other ways to learn. And so how do you bring those worlds together in a place called school? And so the school had to become part of the life of our people. It couldn't just be a separate part. And that's what schools have been made to be separate oases away from the community, away from the families, away from the land, away from the cultural world. And so how do you crash those walls down so that people can bring their knowledge systems into the school from the outside? And for us as the Indigenous people of this country, we've always been asked to leave our knowledge behind. When we walk into a school, when we walk into a university, we have to leave our knowledge behind, outside. It's not acceptable here. There's no place for it here. And then when we go out, what we ask our children, what have our children learned, is to leave the knowledge that they've accumulated within the four walls, to leave that behind, and to pick up their knowledge system when they go out. And that's a tall order to ask of any human, to be able to be able to know how to do that and still remain whole. But that's what we've asked our children to do. That's what we've been forced to do. And so there's so many things that I learned over those years that we had our teacher education program in Mount Currie and when we started our school, that I brought with me into every other institution that I've worked in, to try to help to bring our knowledge and our wisdom into the places of learning. And it isn't easy. It's been a great challenge because education is built on one worldview, and that worldview is supposedly superior, and it doesn't. It's based on what people think is true, the truth, and that it's the best and only way. And so to be able, and so today, especially in all the schooling systems, all the education systems, and I think finally it's beginning at universities to indigenize and to open the space for Indigenous knowledge and wisdom. And I was fortunate to work at the University of Victoria, where I was invited to teach and to bring Indigenous knowledge into the Faculty of Education, and then later into the Department of Linguistics. And so really all that I learned that began in that work had its roots in this program in which we partnered with SFU in the 70s and 80s. And the idea that in a teacher education program, for example, doesn't prepare the people who will teach in schools it was always thought that the only people who needed to know how to teach our people were either the native people or possibly, but not necessarily, the non-Indigenous people who might work in our communities. And so our knowledge became really segregated. It was only good enough for one small group of people. And then the only thing really that we needed to know was things like carving or painting or crafts, and not really the processes by which we learn and teach. And so two things happened. For example, we were trying to prepare language teachers, the people who would teach languages in their communities. And because learning to teach Indigenous languages in this land is not the same as learning how to teach a language that is a second language. Our languages, those programs are usually based on English language, learning English as a second language. And oftentimes, the languages that are learned and taught are languages that are spoken elsewhere. They've thrived elsewhere. They continue elsewhere. But our languages, we're needing to recover them. We're needing to revitalize them. We're needing to maintain them and to shift them from an oral tradition, as I talked about, to a literate tradition. And people need to learn all of the expertise. Their expertise has to be much broader than just teaching a language. Because what we expect people who working with our languages, we expect them to know how to document and archive that language. We need them to know how to speak to elders, to language speakers. We need them to convert that material into teaching material, into literate material. We need them to know how to use technology, and we need them to know how to organize, do community development. And so you can see then, one of the biggest challenges that we have is universities as institutions have developed their system to be discipline-based, to be fragmented, siloed, analytical. Can't have that. If we're when we prepare people to work in our communities, to do the work that they need to do, it has to be cross-discipline. They have to develop expertise much broader. And they have to become very, very flexible and versatile. And the way usually that universities are designed, they're not designed in that way. And so that was a big challenge. The other challenge of doing that kind of work, for example, in an institution, is that the standards that are developed, the recipes that are developed, for example, to say you've got this expertise and you have this from this discipline, it's based on a set world that is different from where we need to exist and work and to rebuild. And so the systems that support a place like a university also are based on a different world. So for example, in order for people to teach our languages, many times, they have to learn and develop in those languages. And so linguistics needs to be a big, major part of it. But linguistics courses were not recognized in British Columbia as part of the criteria of what it meant to be a teacher. So we couldn't use the very courses that our teachers had to learn, they couldn't use. And so that had to change. And so it was really important that places of learning are also active in the credentialing bodies of of a country, and that's something that we had to do, and luckily we were able to make those changes. So that's one of the challenges. So every credentialing body has to be engaged in what is necessary for people to prepare them to do the work that they need to do. And it was the same when we developed a master's in counseling for people who would counsel in our communities. That credentialing body had to be engaged. It was a national body to participate and to be a part of the design of how and what people would learn. And in that degree, we engaged both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people as students in that program. And the first course in that program is a no books, no pens, no computers program. So what people had to use, what they brought. And that was I think, even though I was part of the design of that, I didn't realize the impact that sitting and talking, what it means. There was so much I learned, I remember, in our first cohort, because one of the things that people had to do, and that as the instructors in the course, that we had to be courageous enough, was to help people to bring their knowledge into the room. Because when we talk about decolonization as being an active part of what we do in universities, in educational institutions, that's often what we don't think of, is that we have grown up, we have been schooled to leave our knowledge and our wisdom outside. And so we've been made to believe that we don't have this knowledge and that we don't have this wisdom, and that the only things worth knowing are the things that we find in books. There has been, teaching and learning, active teaching and learning taking place amongst our people all through time. All through time. We wouldn't exist as a people if we didn't have that. It's the same with counseling. We have been focused on making sure that everybody was taken care of by taking care of each other all through time. And so we have to be able to remember what those are, to value those, And it's been something that we have been taught not to do. We've been taught to undervalue, to devalue our own knowledge, our own wisdom. And that's an important part, I think, of what universities and places of learning need to be able to do, is to help people to value their own knowledge. And one of the things that I've learned is that I started thinking about this when it comes to Indigenous people and Indigenous people bringing their own knowledge. But I began a series of courses at the university called Learning and Teaching in an Indigenous World. And the whole course, the whole 13 weeks, is devoted to people getting in touch with what that might mean, to learning in that way, to experience it. Because I think that we can't just talk about it. We have to experience it. We have to feel it. We have to consider it. We have to reflect about it. We have to see how it works. And doing that at a university was pretty challenging, because it's not based on books. It's not based on people writing. It's based on people being present and taking responsibility for their own learning. And in one of those courses, I focused it on storytelling, and had people experience the stories from Indigenous people mostly around from Canada, but around the world. And then I had people tell stories. And I came to find something out that really shocked me. And that is that from this community of learners and the stories that they were exploring and telling, I came to know that as Canadians, as people who grew up in Canada, they too were silenced. They too hadn't been able to tell their own story. And this was the first time that their knowledge, the knowledge of their people, was invited into a classroom. Because when you think about it, when you think about a country being a country of settlers, in order to settle, they have to leave their world behind. And that affects us much more than we ever think it does. And so that was really an important lesson for me. And so when we employ, what I've learned is that when we employ the learning and the teaching practices from our Indigenous world, it contributes really to everybody's world. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, so much of what we've done at universities is to fragment and to segment and to isolate people and what they know and how they come to know, rather than to honor the diversity, the beauty in diversity and the richness in our worlds when we truly and really share. Mm-hmm. I began by talking about our partnership with Simon Fraser, and it feels like I'm coming back full circle, because in getting an honorary degree from Simon Fraser, And it's partly coming full circle and giving, and also the sense of giving back, being in this recognition that that I continue to be part of this community, and that, and to have an opportunity to say to be grateful, and for all the things that I began learning. And I think that that's what a university life, a university, an opportunity to learn at a university, that's what it does. It opens worlds to you that you didn't realize that you could enter, that you could participate in, and it gives you courage, and it gives you possibilities that you don't even dream about at the time when you're beginning your journey. And so much of what I learned in my undergraduate year, I was able to employ throughout my entire career. And so by accepting an honorary degree, I think it's in a sense giving back. Thank you.